Hello, and thanks for joining us for this month's edition of The Scope of Things, a no-nonsense look at the realities and enigmas of clinical research, based on those closest to the action who aim for great and, if need be, are willing to shake things up. I'm Deborah Borfitz, Senior Science Writer for Clinical Research News. In today's inaugural episode, I'll be speaking with Craig Lipset, one of the most recognized names in the industry. Welcome, Craig. I am thrilled to be debuting with you.
Deborah, I am thrilled to be here with you.
For anyone out there who doesn't already know, Craig is a well-respected industry consultant and former head of clinical innovation at Pfizer, who is on the faculty at Rutgers and the University of Rochester, and currently serves as co-chair of the Decentralized Trials and Research Alliance. Okay, Craig, let's get started.
Let's go.
I invited you onto the show to talk about decentralized clinical trials, and that term has been bandied about a lot over the last 2 years. And so I want to be sure listeners know what we're talking about. So, Craig, what exactly makes a clinical trial decentralized, and what different forms might such studies take?
Oh, that's a great question because it does get used in a lot of different ways right now. I tend to fall back on definitions that grew out of the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative, CITI, a public-private partnership with the FDA, as well as with the IMI in Europe and their Trials at Home project. And you start to see a lot of common denominators between the two. Mm-hmm. We're also working on a glossary that will be published through the Decentralized Trials Research Alliance that hopefully will add some more clarity and granularity around a lot of this different jargon. But the definition that I would go with for this conversation, mm-hmm. a decentralized clinical trial is that is using processes and technologies that enable the option for visits to take place outside of a conventional research site. Now, that is about process and technology. So this isn't just about sticking lots of technology in. There's a lot of process change that can be introduced as well. The use of visiting nurses and home health, the ability for specimens and images to be acquired locally, the ability to extend our drug supply chain so it can reach people at home, as well as a lot of the technologies we see today, whether the use of video and e-consent and patient self-reporting and different types of remote monitoring or connected devices. It's not about everything getting stuffed into every trial. It's also, though, you heard me use this term of creating the option for visits to take place outside of a site. And so that doesn't mean that every visit has to take place away from a site. It's really for many about this opportunity to create options and choice for participants to engage in ways that work best for them. And then finally, you didn't hear me say the term at home, because home is one location. It certainly was an important location during the pandemic, but clinical trials that are decentralized can take place in a lot of different locations that offer choice and flexibility for people. And today we see from retail pharmacy to mobile units and pop-up sites, all the way through to the opportunity for visits to take place in my local community physician's office. So I think the audience should be getting the impression from me that decentralized is really an umbrella term. It can encompass the use of a lot of different types of tools to make these trials work, but it's not just about sticking technology in, it's doing it with a purpose, and that purpose is to enable options for how and where people participate.
But nonetheless, this is a major pivot from how studies have been done in the past. And so I'm curious, how much has the FDA weighed in on the decentralized model? I mean, anything yet beyond some draft guidance that they put out a few months ago on digital health technologies in collecting data for endpoint evaluation in decentralized trials? Or because I think there was a series of guidance documents that everyone was waiting on. I'm not sure if they've actually appeared yet.
So I think that the FDA has weighed in on this topic from day zero. And by that, what I mean is, if you look back at the original press release that Pfizer put out announcing the remote trial, There's actually a quote in that press release from Janet Woodcock expressing support for this type of innovation. Now, keep in mind that the FDA doesn't put quotes in Pfizer press releases. That's what I was told by the communications team at Pfizer at the time. But they did here. When you look at, I mentioned earlier, the work from CITI, the Clinical Trials Transformation Initiative that dated back to recommendations in 2018. I served on the program committee for CITI's mobile efforts here. And I can tell you, it was the FDA driving that work. This wasn't industry going to CITI saying we need the FDA to work with us and to create recommendations. It was the other way around, the FDA leaders saying we need these types of recommendations to come out to bring the industry along. Now, during the pandemic, the FDA, like almost every other global regulatory authority, produced important guidance on how to run your studies and sustain them during the COVID-19 pandemic and all the associated lockdowns. But you didn't see the FDA change policy or requirements. The same guardrails for clinical trials existed during the pandemic as they did before and after. We have to make sure that we have protections for patient safety and make sure we have confidence in data integrity. These are our guardrails, and they always have been. What the FDA encouraged study teams to do was take advantage of the tools and technologies that were available, engage with the FDA about the approaches you want to take, and maintain those guardrails. Now, coming out of the pandemic a bit, and as we start to move more to an endemic state, we still see the FDA being very forthright on these topics. The Oncology Center of Excellence last year put out recommendations that when submitting your oncology studies, flag and indicate where remote and decentralized approaches were used. In the FDA's Pandemic Readiness Plan, published earlier in 2021, likewise, this was sort of the silver linings playbook from the FDA of all of the catastrophe of the last 2 years. What were the positives that the FDA should look to support and further amplify? Decentralized trials called out right there. Now, we did see recently the Digital Health Technologies draft guidance issued by the FDA. And so that's certainly an important enabler of modernizing clinical trials in general, including our ability to decentralize by having more flexibility in how we measure things. And so I think again and again, we've seen this very clear voice of support from the agency: maintain our guardrails, safety and data integrity, but take advantage of the flexibility that they make available for sponsors and study teams to engage with and leverage technologies that can improve access and experience along the way.
Yeah. So no real big regulatory barriers there at this point that you're seeing, or where guidance is needed and it's holding things up in any way?
You know what's holding things up from a regulatory perspective? So the FDA has been very clear. We have some other regulatory authorities like those in Denmark and Sweden that have been similarly progressive in publishing and putting out positions and statements and engaging their community around decentralized. I think for some regulatory authorities, though, it's not that we've seen negative statements about decentralized. I don't think we've seen that from any regulatory authority on the planet. What we have seen is more silence in terms of what their expectations or desires will be beyond the pandemic. So no one has overtly said they don't plan to continue to support these approaches, but when there's silence or ambiguity, a conservative industry approaches that with caution. Mm-hmm. And so with DTRA, with the Decentralized Trials Research Alliance, we are looking to more proactively engage with regulatory authorities where there has been a little bit more silence, and helping to disintermediate that for our community.
Okay, very good. Any discernible trends related to the FDA's response to data that's been generated in a decentralized fashion during the pandemic that maybe it's reviewed or is now reviewing for potential marketing approvals? Any lessons learned to report on this front, or is it really just too soon to say?
I think it's too soon to say, but keep in mind that while the idea of a decentralized trial and the way we're seeing it is exciting and the adoption is new, many of the tools, approaches, and methods that we're taking advantage of aren't really new. They've been around and have been used for many years. When we're talking about ePro and patient self-reporting of data, or using certain types of connected devices to support a measurement, we've been using ambulatory blood pressure monitoring and other types of technologies like those for a very long time. So there is good precedent for study teams when it comes to how we measure and what are we submitting as a basis of a regulatory approval. I think an interesting trend we're seeing from the agency right now is what we saw from the Oncology Center of Excellence, this want to learn, to make sure that they're learning for each submission what has been collected in a remote and decentralized way so that they can gather knowledge and insights. I do agree, though, with the question that this is an important time for us to track regulatory approvals on a global basis across different therapeutic areas and understand the regulatory responses that we're seeing. This is going to create an ebb and flow over the next 2 or 3 years around decentralized adoption. Each time we see regulators make another approval based on these approaches, it will create more confidence. And where we do see regulators share hesitation or concern, that's important too, because that transparency gives us the opportunity to address those issues. It removes ambiguity for us, because I don't sense that there are challenges out there that are insurmountable. We just need transparency to know where there may be cause for regulatory hesitation so that we as a community can address it.
Yeah. And to your point about how decentralized trials have been around a long time, I mean, before the pandemic, I think you have said it's like a 17-year history. They were around, Pfizer being, of course, one of the early pioneers and catalyzing a lot of experimentation. But why a lot of these projects never got out of pilot phase, as I understand it, is that operational practices didn't change to accommodate them with the right clinical endpoints and study protocols, still requiring participants to go to bricks and mortar site for procedures like a walking test that can, of course, now be done via an app at home. So a lot of changes were required. What sort of oversight, or what happened overnight when COVID came along? Did everything just suddenly change, or was necessity the mother of invention here? How did this all change, or will it all change?
So while we're talking about the scope of things, it was actually at the Scope Summit 2 years ago, just before the pandemic, that I shared a slide that was titled "That 17-Year History of Decentralized Trials." Of course, it wasn't titled "The 17-Year History Before the Pandemic," because I didn't have that much foresight. But the message that I brought with that slide was there's an oversupply in the market, that in the years prior to the pandemic, CROs, tech companies, drug distribution partners, and others had all developed and announced capability related to supporting this space. Innovators had raised close to about $100 million for young companies to grow in this space. And while there were headlines of pharma companies doing things, most of those things were just pilots, experiments, and one-offs. Very few had beyond maybe a cluster of 5 studies that they were trying out. Nobody had driven scale and meaningful adoption in their organizations. The pandemic certainly changed things. What it changed is adoption. What it changed is the perception of risk and benefit. Because prior to the pandemic, so many of these approaches were looked at as introducing potential risk in our studies. And during the pandemic, the risk of the environment was greater than the risk of adoption. In fact, these decentralized methods that had been viewed at as potentially risky suddenly became the risk countermeasure for an unpredictable environment, when patients could not reliably get to clinics in order to access medicines, be monitored for safety, or share important outcomes data for efficacy. All of a sudden, decentralized research tools became a countermeasure. Risk mitigation, people know how to adopt. Innovation can be hard to adopt, but risk mitigation, we adopt in earnest. And now, coming where we are in the cycle of the pandemic, these approaches are no longer foreign to our organizations. We don't have to fall back and say, it's risky because I don't know how my compliance team, my regulatory team, my quality team, my legal team will respond, because now we've done it. And throughout our portfolios on trials around the world. But importantly, over the last year, we've seen most major sponsors of research embed this change in their organization, because they know change doesn't come cheap and easy, and it's not just a magic wand. Change is a process inside of a large and complex organization. We have to look at our SOPs and our policies. We have to look at our training and our protocol templates. We have to look at our vendor lists to see if we have all these categories covered. That's what we've seen organizations do over the last year that really signals this change is actually going to outlast the pandemic.
So is one of the main rationales for decentralized trials, now and moving forward, to open studies up to more people, some of whom live many hours from a university where many investigators work, or they can't or don't want to travel to a traditional study site, versus like during COVID, when it was primarily driven by the inability of participants to go to a physical site because it was temporarily shuttered?
There is definitely a convergence of a lot of factors here that are helping sustain momentum around decentralized. People have taken notice of participant experience. This is something that organization sponsors had started to measure. There's a Transcelerate measurement tool that launched prior to the pandemic, indicative of how research sponsors were taking experience seriously. Certainly during the last 2, 3, 4 years, diversity in clinical research, equity, representation has become more than just lip service and rhetoric, but become an important commitment for research organizations to invest around. And then finally, this theme around resilience in an unpredictable environment. I think all three of these factors are contributing to the sustainability of decentralized research. Yes, we want to open up more access for participants agnostic to geography, across socioeconomic divides, across race and ethnic barriers that may have existed. And so experience, diversity, inclusion, representation all matter. But we live in an unpredictable environment today. I don't know if there's a COVID-23 murder hornets, war, fire. I don't know what barrier is going to stand in the way of research participants in my next trial being able to consistently get to the clinic. It is noteworthy where we are having this conversation right now. Just as there seems to be a bit of a lull in the pandemic, we're watching the rise of tension, hostility, and war in Eastern Europe. The spirit of an unpredictable environment is going to be with us. And decentralized is more than just an experience and diversity tool. It's a countermeasure for this unpredictability.
Good point. Let's talk best case scenario with decentralized clinical trials, though. I mean, obviously, not every clinical study can be conducted at home or probably even in a community. Patients may be simply too sick and require a lot of close ongoing monitoring. So where have we seen decentralized clinical trials work particularly well all the way around? And I'm just going to throw out that I sat in on a session by a gal from Exact Sciences talking about how they did really well with a decentralized model, particularly in terms of diversity, with 100% virtual cancer screening study. It was, in this case, a trial for in vitro diagnostic device, Cologuard. Any thoughts on all this?
I would position that I would expect to see easily 80% of our clinical trial portfolio benefit by including some aspect of decentralized research methods within. There will be very few exceptions in terms of the studies that will not include some elements of decentralization. Keep in mind that it's the minority today that are fully decentralized trials that are involving interventions of new medicines, of new drugs. Most of the archetypes that we see are hybrid. Hybrid is not a compromise. I think that in years past, some might have had rhetoric that, today we're brick and mortar, and that hybrid is a fuzzy middle state to a desired end state of fully decentralized clinical trials. But as somebody who for the last decade plus has been spending time with patients in different disease areas, talking about and listening to concerns around access, I've met very few patients in my life that have said to me, I wish that there was no longer a research site that I could visit. I wish I could not go and see an investigator in person. When you look at data from Tufts, when you look at data from Trial Journey and others that track the experience of participants in research, SysGrip and others, research participant experience is overwhelmingly positive. Patients actually like the engagement they have with investigators. It's overwhelmingly positive. The challenge is they can't always get there. They can't access that site. And so for that reason, hybrid trials will continue to make a ton of sense. I think the stretch for us, the desired end state, is how do we engage with more flexibility and choice? How do we look at a visit by visit schedule of events in our protocol and identify for each visit what are the different ways that a patient could participate? Could visit 3 be done through video or a visiting nurse or coming into the clinic, but maybe visit 4, you're going to have to come into the clinic. And so giving people choice wherever we can to improve access, not closing doors along the way, but opening more. And that is a lofty goal. It's a hard goal to operationalize. It's actually much harder to operationalize than a fully decentralized trial, because now we're describing futures where different patients might engage in different ways. We might have to have visiting nurses in our study as well as sites, as well as video-based options. We might have to have a few different solutions available, but this is the way we as consumers engage in the world. I ordered DoorDash for dinner and I still want to go to a restaurant. We might have Instacart do grocery shopping and the next week we want to go into the supermarket. We don't want these places to close. We want to have exactly what you said, Deborah. We want to have choice.
Yeah, personalized clinical trial experience.
And that's hard. It's hard not only in terms of the operational complexity, but our guardrails, safety and data integrity. It's hard also because here we want to make sure we have confidence in our data, agnostic to where it's being acquired, whether it's in the home, in the office, in the research site, in my doctor's office. I need to rely even more on smarter digital measurements that I can include in my studies, digital measurements that don't care where the data is being collected and can give me that type of flexibility without any compromise to the integrity of the data.
Have you ever seen a decentralized trial go kind of sideways? And if so, what went wrong?
Well, look, our remote trial went sideways 17 years ago. So there's a long history of going lateral.
Okay.
We struggled to enroll at that time because we were very aggressive on exclusively enrolling that entirely online trial by going direct to patient, and didn't really invest enough at the time in terms of our engagement and inclusion and shared decision making, and how do we include patients treating physicians in that process. I think a source of things going sideways today might be examples where there's burdensome technology that wasn't fully vetted and challenged through different simulation and testing before going live. I think a second would be instances where people haven't invested enough in patient support, making sure that when people are not coming in for every visit, that they're not feeling isolated or left alone along the way. Making sure our technology and data flows have been fully baked and thought through. And I think a final challenge for many operators today has been managing quality and consistency in home health. I think that for many organizations, implementing technology we're very comfortable with. But choosing unfamiliar partners who haven't operated in a clinical trial space to support home visits can create uncertainty. And it only takes a few bad stories of an occasional visit gone wrong to circulate widely in an organization and create a sense of fear.
I was talking with a friend that knew nothing about clinical trials, let alone decentralized clinical trials, a few days ago. And one question that came up that I really couldn't adequately answer, I'm going to throw at you now, was particularly if a decentralized trial is being done in a home, and I know they're not always done in that environment, but what about all the extraneous variables introduced when a trial is conducted in someone's home, like someone in the house who smokes, or air contaminants blowing in from outside, or noise disrupting a participant's sleep, or any of the various stressors that might affect blood pressure readings or how a drug is metabolized? I mean, I think you get the picture. I understand the importance of accounting for these social determinants of health, and it wouldn't be great if we could one day have enough data to start doing subgroup analysis based on such factors. But right now, I'm not sure that they are being accounted for, and home situations can vary tremendously. So doesn't this mess with the integrity of study findings, or is all the variability a good thing in that study results will more closely mirror real world situations in patients?
I think it's a fascinating question, Deborah. I think we also have to keep in mind, though, that 99% of every research participant's study experience is taking place in their home and not in a research site, unless you're in a phase 1 study where you're in a dedicated research unit and staying there for a day, a week, or 3 weeks. For most research participants, they're at home, they're at work, they're coming into the clinic periodically. And for some, that's a burden in terms of work and life balance, or the distance that's required for that to happen. But they are at home in that smoke-filled environment, or that noise-polluted environment, or that environment with, an unstable food source, or whatever that environment may be. Now, in a decentralized trial, we do have to balance privacy, safety, in terms of if there will be a home visit. I think for some participants, that's why more location options are a great thing, whether it's a mobile unit, a pop-up site, or the ability for that visit to take place at a local pharmacy or their own doctor's office, simply because they're not comfortable, or it's maybe not an appropriate environment for a visit to take place in their home. But I think you really hit on it by flagging these other social determinants, which we typically aren't capturing, measuring, and understanding in our research studies. But it is going to become more and more critical for us to understand the association of these social determinants and the outcomes that we see in our trials. Sometimes the outcome differences we see in patients may be due to a genetic or molecular factor. Sometimes it may be due to an environmental factor that we're not properly understanding or measuring in our studies today. Hopefully, our use of more continuous measures in our trials will help to give us a better sense of the data from people in their real world settings. And as you said, getting more data in real world settings will help this data to become truly generalizable for patients who may be exposed to a new medicine, rather than what may be viewed as a rather artificially constructed set of data, simply based on, this artificial period of time when a patient is coming into a medical setting.
Yeah, good point. And okay, I'd like to switch gears now, if I can, to talk about patient ownership of their data, a topic of one of your TED Talks a few years back that is perhaps even more relevant in the context of decentralized trials, where so many new data flows are being created. So has it become any easier over time for people to share their data with researchers, which are apparently more than happy to do so?
I love this topic. Thanks so much for bringing it up. When I spoke about this on a TED stage years, it was really with this theme that Our data is being shared already in so many different ways. And shouldn't patients have greater say and voice, both in terms of transparency to know when their data is being shared, but importantly, in prospective research, the ability for patients to be the source of aggregating and permitted sharing of their data. Now, in decentralized clinical trials, this, you're right, becomes an important part of the story because we need to show that the diversity of data that we need for a research study is not being compromised just because a participant may not be coming into a research setting for every one of their visits.
Mm-hmm.
The ability for me as a person to have access to and share trusted health data from electronic sources in the healthcare setting and bring that into research studies is a really important and powerful part of the story. In part because a fully decentralized may not have a local doctor that I see as an investigator to tap into their EHR. And so we do see this renaissance of approaches that have been emerging in recent years. We see the ability for patients to use platforms that rely on a HIPAA right of access, where you might be asked to sign a release, and that partner goes and fetches your data from all of its different sources. We see approaches that are using data standards linked to patient portals that are tapping into FHIR standards and others to pull data out electronically. We see models like the trial tokenization approaches we were discussing at Scope, where research participants can enable a privacy-preserving token to be generated based on their identifiable information that can then allow researchers to pull their data out of otherwise de-identified aggregated data sets. And in all of these different scenarios, enable me as a person participating with consent in a prospective trial to allow the researchers to pull my electronic health record data into this study. I think that this is a great strategy for transparency. It's a great strategy for inclusion, and it's a great strategy for not compromising in the diversity of data that we would want to rely upon for our research.
And this sounds like a perfectly sound idea, but I don't believe tokenization, as you've been describing, has caught on yet. Is anybody doing it currently? And what are sort of the roadblocks, and where do you see this, in fact, taking place, and how soon?
So we can think about, for our audience, keep in mind when we're talking about tokens here, this isn't a blockchain story.
Thank you for clarifying that.
This is basically an algorithm that will use personally identifying information about me and create a code that is unique to me and can do that consistently, whether I'm giving my electronic consent up front in the study and sharing information, or whether that algorithm is then run against aggregated data coming from electronic health records of hospitals and can then link me without necessarily knowing that it's me that's being linked. Now, the part that's working right now is we've seen how during the electronic informed consent process, we can link a tokenizing process to that and be able to generate tokens with patient permission and consent. I think where we still struggle is how do we bring all this data together, and what are the use cases that it's going to be most meaningful and impactful to bring this data together. Now, some folks that have been leaders in this, like Kyle Holan from AbbVie, and has shared some of his work from AbbVie at Scope over a few years' time, are really showing how we can proactively generate tokens for patients in research studies, or even just save protected health information in a way to be able to batch token individuals later on, even if we're not actually going then to that next step of fetching their EHR data and bringing it in. It's kind of like a proactive insurance plan so that if there are safety issues, if there's another precision medicine use case that emerges, if long-term follow-up becomes a critical attribute for that development program, we can go back and get that EHR data because the token already exists and is being saved for that purpose. So companies like AbbVie, because of individual leaders, J&J, I think, is another that I think has shown a lot of forethought and planning. Many, I think, are still trying to understand what is that real priority use case that bringing in this EHR data for the individuals in my trial is going to address.
Yeah, it's going to be another couple of years then, no doubt.
I would say so. I would say so. And the token story will fit alongside of some of these other strategies that together will be another solution for how we electronically source data in our trials.
Very good. Craig, this has been unsurprisingly a fascinating conversation, but like all good things, must come to an end. Thanks again for agreeing to be my first ever guest on the show. Really appreciate it.
It was a pleasure, Deborah. I look forward to hearing so many more episodes and more guests getting better and better, more fabulous conversations. But I was really thrilled to help kick this off with you today.
Thank you so much. And thanks to everyone out there for listening in. For more straight talk on studies involving humans, visit clinicalresearchnewsonline.com. And if you're a clinical research professional, we hope also to see you at our next Scope conference where we make things happen. Bye for now.